I remember that night clearly, a cold winter night with snow blanketing the hills in rural Pennsylvania. I had just moved to this small farm not long ago, hoping to find a peaceful life after retirement. The old wooden house stood alone in the middle of a dense forest, far from the main road. For others, this might seem like isolation, but for me, it was paradise, a place to escape the hustle and bustle of the outside world. I had been living alone since I lost my wife, Margaret, 5 years ago. She passed away from an incurable illness, and since then, I hadn't been able to find peace within myself. The first few nights here, the quiet of the countryside initially brought me comfort. But then, that night came. That day, after a long day of cleaning the barn and clearing the weeds, I decided to rest early. I sat by the fireplace, sipping a cup of hot tea, listening to the crackling of the fire. The entire house seemed to sink into absolute tranquility. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, a strange sound echoed from afar, a noise like the wind whistling through the cracks, but it was more unusual. I didn't think much of it, simply assuming it was the sound of the wind or falling snow. However, at midnight, I was awakened by a long, drawn-out wailing coming from somewhere outside in the yard. I quietly got up, put on a thick coat, and grabbed my flashlight. As I opened the front door, the biting cold rushed in instantly. The weak light from the flashlight barely illuminated the path ahead. I looked around, only to see snow covering everything. There were no signs of anything out of the ordinary. Perhaps, I thought, it was just the sound of wild animals. But when I turned to go back inside, I saw it. A trail of deep footprints in the snow. They were small, like those of a child, leading from the edge of the woods right up to my front door. A chill spread from head to toe, but I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could just be old footprints. I went back inside, locked the door securely. It was strange, I thought, because no one lived nearby, and the footprints appeared right after the snowfall. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound in the house startled me. The creaking of the wooden floorboards, the wind howling outside the window, and that strange wailing sound. It still echoed from somewhere in the forest. Even though it was dark and the snowstorm was intensifying, I decided I needed to find out what was going on. The next morning, I woke up to the weak sunlight streaming through the window. Everything seemed back to normal. But when I stepped outside, I saw that the footprints were still clear in the snow, and there were more of them now. They circled around the house and then disappeared into the woods. I couldn't understand what was happening, but it made me uneasy. I decided to head into the village to see Joe, the closest grocer. He was the only person I knew around here and had lived in the area his whole life. When I told him about the strange footprints and the wailing sound, Joe just sat there silently, his face growing tense. Finally, he said, "You're not the first to experience this. There was a family that lived in that house before, and something bad happened. Their little girl went missing during a snowstorm. They searched everywhere, but never found her. Folks believe her spirit still wanders through those woods, trying to find her way home." Joe's story sent a chill down my spine. I didn't believe in ghosts, but something about this situation made it impossible to shake the feeling of unease. Afterward, I returned home, determined to uncover the truth. The following night, I prepared myself for whatever or whoever was lurking around my property. I locked the doors, checked my gun, and made sure I had enough light to keep the area around the house in sight. As night fell, the wailing returned. This time, it was closer, clearer. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the yard. The wind howled past my ears, snow falling heavily, but I could still hear the sound. It was coming from the woods. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to follow that call. Despite my fear, I began to walk, my footprints quickly disappearing into the snow as I ventured deeper into the forest. Everything around me became eerily silent. Then, I saw her. She stood there, in the middle of the woods, wearing a white dress, her wide eyes staring directly at me. Her pale face was unmistakable. This was the girl Joe had mentioned. But what was more terrifying was that she didn't move, just stood there as if waiting for me to come closer. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. I took a few steps forward, but when I was just a few feet away, she suddenly vanished into thin air, as if she had never been there at all. I stood frozen, unable to believe my eyes. This couldn't be happening. I returned to the house, unable to stop thinking about what I had just witnessed. The next night, I decided not to go outside, but the wailing still echoed from the forest. It continued for many nights, as if reminding me that something was out there, waiting for me. A week later, I decided to leave the house. I couldn't live in fear and constant dread any longer. I sold the farm and moved to a place closer to friends and family. I never went back to that forest, but every time I remember it, I still feel the chill of the snowstorm and the empty eyes of that little girl. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, I wonder if she ever found her way home. But deep down, I know her spirit is still lost in those woods, wandering through an endless night. My name is Jack, and I live in a small town in Montana. It's a peaceful place, surrounded by majestic mountains, wide but empty roads, and a night sky filled with stars. But that tranquility sometimes hides things you'll never forget. I work for a food transportation company, mainly delivering groceries and essentials to retail stores around the area. It's not a bad job, but it means I often have to drive long distances late into the night. This has forced me to get used to the eerie stillness of deserted roads, where only darkness and the headlights of my truck keep me company. One night, after a long day of work, I was driving home at around 2 a.m. It was freezing cold, and the road was pitch black, except for the faint glow of scattered streetlights. These late-night drives were something I had grown accustomed to, but the feeling of isolation and exhaustion was always hard to shake. After making my last delivery, I realized I was starving. I had only had coffee and energy drinks all day, enough to keep me awake, but leaving me jittery. So, I decided to stop at a small diner right off the highway, about 15 minutes from my house. It was a 24/7 diner, a place I frequented after my late shifts. The food wasn't fancy, but it was good enough to fill the empty stomach on long nights like this. When I pulled into the lot, it was nearly empty. Only 2 cars were parked, an old SUV and an old Ford pickup. The Ford was parked in the far corner of the lot, right under a flickering streetlight. It looked run down, rusty, and something about it seemed off. It wasn't what I expected to see at this hour. I tried to shake off the uneasiness and headed inside the diner. The owner, Mary, an older woman who knew me well from my regular late-night stops, greeted me. I sat down at my usual booth and ordered a burger and a hot coffee. As I waited for my food, I couldn't help but glance out the window. My eyes kept drifting toward that old Ford. The dim light outside wasn't enough to see clearly inside the truck, but I could make out a silhouette. Someone was sitting in there. The feeling of unease grew inside me, but I told myself it was probably just another truck driver stopping to rest, like me. However, I still couldn't take my eyes off the car. After my food was brought out, I tried to focus on my meal and the steaming cup of coffee. But each time I looked up, The old truck was still there, motionless, and the figure inside showed no signs of movement. I ate faster than usual, the sense of unease growing stronger. After paying and leaving the diner, the cold night air immediately engulfed me. The parking lot was still quiet, but I couldn't help glancing toward the Ford as I walked back to my own truck. Suddenly, I saw the man in the truck step out. He didn't head toward the diner. He just stood there, staring directly at me. I hurried to open my truck door, jumped inside, and locked the doors. My heart started pounding. He remained standing there, motionless, just watching. I quickly started the engine and backed out of the parking lot. As soon as I pulled away, the Ford's headlights came on, and it began following me. There was no mistaking it now. He was tailing me. I tried to stay calm, driving faster to put some distance between us. But the Ford kept pace. Not too close, but not far enough either. Fear started to creep up inside me, but I couldn't stop. I decided to turn onto a small side road, hoping he wouldn't follow, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror, he was still there. I drove into a remote forested area, a road not many people knew about, and few traveled this late at night. I had driven this road hundreds of times, but tonight it felt terrifying. I could feel that I was being stalked, and if something happened, no one would be able to help me. I sped up, trying to shake him off, but he persisted, keeping up with me. Everything around me dissolved into thick darkness, with only the Ford's headlights shining from behind. I had to think of something, and fast. I decided to turn onto another small road, trying to put more distance between us. When I reached a crossroads, I slowed down and pulled over to the side, cutting the headlights and sitting still. I hoped he wouldn't see me and would drive past. But after a few minutes, I saw the Ford also pull over. Its headlights went off, and the man stepped out again. He started walking toward my truck. My heart was pounding in my chest. He was getting closer, just a few meters away. I didn't wait any longer, quickly turning the lights back on and flooring the gas pedal, speeding down the narrow road. As the truck surged forward, I immediately called Danny, my best friend. I knew I couldn't go home, and I needed somewhere safe. Danny lived nearby, and I hoped he could help me. "I'm being followed," I said, my voice shaking. "There's a guy driving a Ford, and he's tailing me. I'm heading to your place." Danny immediately told me to drive straight to his house, and I didn't hesitate. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, but the Ford was nowhere in sight. Maybe I had finally lost him. When I arrived at Danny's place, I quickly parked and rushed inside. The two of us sat in his living room, not saying a word, but I could feel the tension hanging in the air. Even though I had gotten away, I still couldn't shake the fear that lingered inside me. The next morning, Danny delivered some chilling news. The police had caught the driver of that Ford. He was a stalker who had been following and threatening people in the area for weeks. Hearing this, I shuddered. If I hadn't been careful that night, I might have become his next victim. After that night, I never went back to that diner again. Late night drives became more daunting, and every time I saw a car following me on the road, I couldn't help but think back to that terrifying night. In rural Ohio, where endless fields stretch out and houses are sparsely scattered, there's an old school that has been abandoned for years. The locals rarely talk about it, but anyone who has lived long enough knows the place is tied to unfortunate events. The school, built in the 1940s, was suddenly closed in the late 80s after a horrific accident that the student. Soon after, rumors of the school being haunted began to spread. That year, my friends Jake, Lily, Mark, and Heather Rand I decided to explore the abandoned school. We had just graduated from high school and didn't have much else to do during the summer. Jake came up with the idea, driven by his passion for ghost stories and always wanting to test his courage. Although I was uncomfortable with the idea, I didn't want to be seen as the coward of the group. So, we decided to go on a Friday night at the end of July. We drove out around 9 p.m. and stopped in front of the old school's gate. The summer sky still had a faint light, but thick, dark clouds were rolling in, as if a storm was approaching. The school looked old and decrepit, with shattered windows and overgrown weeds scattered around the yard. Everything was engulfed in a gloomy atmosphere that I couldn't quite describe. We all stood in front of the gate, silently staring at the school for a few minutes. Jake broke the silence. "Let's go in," he said, with a false sense of confidence. Heather, who seemed the most nervous in the group, sighed but agreed. We climbed over the rusty gate and walked into the schoolyard. Our footsteps seemed to be swallowed by the heavy atmosphere around us. There were no other sounds besides the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. The front door of the school was locked, but Mark, always the prepared one, quickly found an open window. We climbed inside and flashed our flashlights to see better. The hallways were pitch black, without a single flicker of light. Dust covered the walls and ceiling, as if the school had been forgotten for ages. The old paintings on the walls were cracked and peeling, making it seem like the faces in the paintings were slowly fading away. "This place looks like something straight out of a horror movie," Lily whispered. We walked down the hallway, our flashlights sweeping across the empty rooms. Suddenly, a small rattling noise came from behind us, just loud enough to make everyone stop. Jake laughed out loud, trying to seem brave. "It's just the wind." But deep down, I knew there were no open windows, and there was no wind outside. We continued deeper into the school, reaching a large room that Jake said used to be the main classroom. We stepped inside and were immediately drawn to a large blackboard where faint chalk markings were still visible. Suddenly, Mark, usually the calmest of the group, shouted. "What is that?" he yelled, pointing to the corner of the room. We all turned and saw a large, dark object sitting in the corner. It was an old, rocking chair, but the strange thing was that it was moving gently, as if someone had just sat down and then stood up. None of us moved closer to check it out. The whole group seemed frozen for a moment. "We should leave," Heather stammered, her voice shaky. This wasn't a good idea. But Jake, in a moment of recklessness, decided to approach the chair. "There's nothing here," he said mockingly. "You guys are just scared." As soon as he finished speaking, another noise echoed from the hallway, this time louder and clearer, like footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps, as if someone was approaching us. My heart pounded in my chest. Everything seemed to stop. No one dared to breathe. "Damn," Jake whispered. "We're not alone here." Lily tugged on my arm, her eyes filled with fear. "We have to get out of here now." We all agreed and quickly rushed back to the hallway. As we ran past the window we had entered through, I swear I heard a laugh, a soft giggle, echoing through the darkness. We jumped out of the window and hurried back to the car. No one in the group said a word as we drove away from the school. The atmosphere in the car was heavy, as if something invisible was weighing down on us. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. The image of the rocking chair in the corner kept flashing in my mind, and the sound of footsteps and laughter echoed in my thoughts. A few days later, I heard that the old school had been demolished to make way for new housing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something remained in the darkness of that school, waiting for curious souls like us. The events of that night were never explained. We never went back there, and none of us wanted to talk about what happened. The only thing we were sure of was that, on that night, we encountered something that didn't belong to this world. Years later, when I told this story to some new friends, no one believed me. They laughed and thought it was just our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I knew the truth. What happened in that abandoned school wasn't just a joke, it was real. And it still exists, waiting for those curious and brave enough to step into the deadly darkness. My name is Alex. Growing up in an old house in the outskirts of Wisconsin, I always felt lucky to have such a vast space to explore and play in. But gradually, as I reached my teenage years, the quiet and the darkness here started to make me feel uneasy. Especially after that night, I began to see the house with a different perspective. It was a cold evening in mid-December. Outside, snow was falling heavily, creating a quiet and lonely atmosphere. My mother, a nurse, often worked night shifts that lasted until morning. It was just me and my younger brother, Michael, who was only 8 years old. We were the only ones left in the house, as usual on nights when Mum was at work. That night, Michael went to bed early, while I sat on the living room sofa, engrossed in my phone. The only sounds I could hear were the wind howling outside the window and the occasional crackling of the fireplace. Everything was normal. Nothing seemed out of place. I wasn't concerned and just thought it was another ordinary night. Around 2 a.m., as I was about to turn off the lights and head to bed, an unexpected sound came from the basement below. It wasn't too loud, but enough to catch my attention like metal clashing together, distinctly clear in the stillness of the night. I frowned, wondering if the strong wind outside might have shaken something in the house. But then, a few seconds later, the sound came again, louder and clearer this time. It was like someone was moving heavy objects in the basement. My heart started pounding. I wasn't easily scared, but I'd never liked our basement since I was a kid. It was dark, damp, and no matter how many times we cleaned it, that cold feeling always lingered. I glanced up the stairs leading to Michael's room, ensuring he was still fast asleep. I didn't want to wake him, but I couldn't ignore the strange sound. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was probably just something that fell. Maybe an old box. I stood up, grabbed the flashlight, and decided to check it out. The basement door, which hadn't been opened in a while, creaked as I pushed it open. The thick darkness below seemed to be waiting for me. I turned on the flashlight, its dim light shining down the wooden steps. Each of my footsteps creaked steadily. I couldn't stop myself from imagining that something terrifying was waiting for me down there. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the basement appeared in the flashlight's beam. Nothing unusual, just old boxes and unused furniture. But something didn't feel right. A strange sensation engulfed me, sending chills down my spine. I turned my head, scanning the room for the source of the noise. And then I saw a large metal shelf had been tipped over. Boxes were scattered across the floor, and in the middle of the mess was an old rocking chair, something I had never seen in the basement before. The unease intensified when I realized the chair was moving gently, as if someone had just sat in it and stood up. I froze in place, unsure whether to approach it or run out. But before I could decide, my flashlight flickered and then went out completely. The basement plunged into complete darkness. I felt a cold breeze pass by, even though no windows were open. Suddenly, a soft sigh came from the corner of the room. I stood frozen, straining to listen. The sigh wasn't mine, and it certainly wasn't Michael's. It sounded very close, like someone was standing right behind me. I bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. My heart was pounding, and I swear I could hear footsteps following me. As I slammed the basement door shut, I heard a loud thud from below. Everything went quiet, but the eerie feeling hadn't left me. I stood there for a while, taking deep breaths to calm myself down. Not wanting to wake Michael, I decided to check on him to make sure he was safe. He lay there, sleeping soundly, completely unaware of what had just happened. I sat down next to his bed, feeling uneasy. The feeling that something was very wrong in the basement still lingered over me. The next morning, when my mother got home, I told her what had happened. She wasn't too concerned, thinking it was probably just old furniture falling over. But I knew better. Something was down there in the basement, and it wasn't just old clutter. Since that night, I never went down to the basement again. Whenever strange noises echoed from below, I would get chills, but I tried not to pay too much attention to it. However, that eerie feeling always persisted, as if the basement still held something hidden that I couldn't explain. Years later, after I had left that house and moved elsewhere, the memory of that basement would still return in my dreams. In those dreams, I could still hear the sighs, still feel the cold breeze, and still see that rocking chair gently swaying in the dark. When I woke up, I would wonder if maybe I had just been overly anxious. But then I would remember that feeling of unease, remember those strange sounds. And I knew that there are some things we simply cannot explain. That house, with its dark basement, still held secrets I never wanted to uncover again. The story ends here, but that chilling feeling still haunts me whenever I think back to what happened on that dead of night. In my final year of college, I moved into an old house in New Orleans, a place most students avoided due to its isolation and lack of modern amenities. However, the rent was cheap, and I was drawn to the spacious antique charm of the house. Built in the 1920s with Victorian architecture, tall windows, and wide ceilings, the house, though somewhat worn, had a unique allure, especially as the crisp autumn air began to fill the city. One of the house's unique features was the basement. It was divided into two parts. One area was a storage space for old things, and the other was a small room with a locked iron door. Everyone was curious about the room, but no one had the key, and the landlord didn't know much about it either. We tried a few times to break the lock, but failed. Occasionally, the three of us joked that there was either treasure or a terrible secret inside, but none of us really cared enough to investigate further, until one night in October, when everything changed. That evening, I had just finished my last assignment for the week, and looked forward to a relaxing night before bed. Sarah and Matt had gone out with friends, so I was home alone. I sat on the sofa in the living room, a small lamp turned on, scrolling through social media. As the night deepened, the house grew eerily quiet. Around 1 a.m., my eyelids began to feel heavy. I was about to turn off the light and head to bed when suddenly I heard a faint sound coming from the basement. It was a strange noise, like metal clinking together. I told myself it was probably just the old pipes or the ancient heating system making noise. But then the sound came again, louder and clearer, like someone was trying to open an iron door. Anxiety began to creep into me, but I still decided to check it out. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly made my way down to the basement. Each step creaked under my weight, and the air seemed to grow colder as I neared the lower level. When I reached the bottom, everything went silent. I shone the flashlight around the basement, seeing nothing but old boxes and cobwebs. But the iron door, which had always been locked, was now wide open. I stood frozen, unable to believe my eyes. That door had been locked since we moved in. My heart raced in my chest. Part of me wanted to run away immediately, but a strange curiosity drove me closer. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness inside the room. It was narrow, only slightly larger than a storage closet. The ceiling was low, with a small light bulb dangling from above. I stepped back, a chill running down my spine. Every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong here. I couldn't explain what was happening, but the unease only grew stronger. I turned and bolted up the stairs. As I shut the basement door, I heard another sound behind me, like the iron door closing. The next morning, when Sarah and Matt returned, I told them what had happened. They looked at me with skeptical eyes, but when we went down to the basement together, the iron door was locked tightly again. Both of them laughed, saying I was probably just stressed after a long week of school. But I knew exactly what I had seen. Since that night, I never dared go into the basement alone again. Every time I passed the iron door, I always felt something was off, as if something was waiting inside, waiting for the door to open again. As the school year passed, I gradually forgot about the basement door, or at least I tried to. We graduated and moved out of that house. But sometimes, on quiet, still nights, I still dream of that house. In those dreams, I find myself standing before the iron door again, and inside, the chair continues to spin. The haunting didn't stop with the house. When I moved to a new place, the strange noises continued to echo in my mind, and the fear lingered somewhere deep inside. I began hearing ghostly stories from new friends, and wondered if those things could be real. One night, sitting around a campfire with friends, I decided to tell them about my experience in the old house. I saw a chair spinning in a locked room, I said, trying to make the story more dramatic. There was no one else there but me, and as I got closer, this overwhelming feeling of fear hit me. My friends laughed, but something didn't feel right. A girl named Lily, who had lived in New Orleans her whole life, looked at me seriously. "There are a lot of things that can't be explained in this city," she said. "I've heard many stories about old houses. Some people say that restless spirits linger where they once lived." I didn't think much of what she said, but a part of me still remembered that strange little room. One evening, I decided to return to the old house. I didn't know why, but curiosity drove me there. Standing before the iron door, my heart raced. The door was still locked, but I couldn't help but think about what had happened in that room. I was prepared to find nothing, but then a cold breeze swept past, as if something was waiting for me. In the end, I decided to leave and never return. I knew there were things that couldn't be explained, and maybe it was best to leave them in the past. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I still hear the chair spinning in my mind, like a reminder that darkness still exists in places we cannot see, and that secrets are always waiting to be discovered. As I started my new life with new experiences, I learned that not everything can be explained. There are simple things we just can't understand, things that go beyond human imagination. It could be lingering spirits, or perhaps just memories of what once was. And so, the story of the spinning chair in the little room remains a part of my journey. Every time I think back, I wonder if anyone else has experienced something similar, or if what I went through was merely a product of my imagination. Either way, I know there are things in this world we can never explain, and that's what makes life all the more fascinating.